Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Daniel Auble. I'm a senior researcher at OpenSecrets, and I'm joined today by our Deputy Research Director, Pete Quist. I am largely in charge of lobbying and revolving door at the federal level, and Pete focuses more on the state level. If you've made it this far without being familiar with OpenSecrets, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan group. We are the premier money and politics data provider, and our mission is to create a more informed public. This is the third of 6 sessions in our lobbying masterclass series. The next one will be on September 13th, and it will be focused on energy interests and the environment. Feel free to look at the previous sessions we held. The last one we did was on the pharmaceutical and healthcare industries. And then the first one we did is a good overview of all the tools related to lobbying that we have on OpenSecrets and Follow the Money, which is where a lot of the state stuff lives. I would like to thank the Omidyar Network for their support of this and other work we're doing examining federal and state lobbying activity. I also want to mention the support of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, who's also supporting some work focusing on defense issues over the last several years. So today we'll again show you some of the tools available to explore lobbying and focus largely on the defense industry. And again, go back to that first session, which is available to watch the recording of if you want a more general overview of all the lobbying tools we have. So with that, I'll hand off to Pete to kind of set us up for the rest of the session.
Thanks, Dan, and hello, everyone. So my name is Pete Quist. As Dan mentioned, I'm the Deputy Research Director here at OpenSecrets. And we're examining lobbying here today at the federal and state levels. We collect the amount of money spent on lobbying at the federal level and in selected states. Currently, we have this information in 19 states. We also have registrations available in all 50 states. So who is registered to lobby for whom without the money aspect of it. We do only have the spending in selected states because disclosure of lobbying at the state level is somewhat poor. Mainly, and I'll mention this for each of these presentations, the big hurdle for us is that the money spent on lobbying is really dominated by how much a company or organization pays a lobbyist or firm to represent them, that compensation piece. Not so much on what the lobbyists are spending on luncheons and things like that. That's a much smaller piece of the money spent on lobbying. And in about half of the states, that compensation piece, what those companies and organizations are paying to be represented, is not reported as lobbying spending. And so in those states, we do not collect the data because it typically, that's typically about 90% of the money spent on lobbying. And so the efforts just don't, it's too much effort for the payout on that. However, we do have it in quite a few states and a very robust federal data set. And we've done some examination of our lobbying data since the merger in 2021 between the Center for Responsive Politics and the National Institute on Money and Politics. We have found some interesting trends overall with lobbying, particularly with the domination of specific firms at the federal level on Capitol Hill, and then at the state level, seeing firms that are really powerhouses within their states and sometimes regionally. What we find is that organizations, companies, and other organizations that are lobbying are not hiring necessarily for expertise, hiring firms or lobbyists for expertise, but rather for those relationships. And so Dan will talk a little bit more about revolving door later, but this is really the key aspect for firms and which firms a company is going to hire are those relationships with sitting legislators. So lobbying specifically, as we're referring to it here, will mean that effort to sway public policy at the legislative decision-making level. And we will also touch a little bit on contributions from the defense industry here today to take a look at how those contributions might pave the way for some lobbying. And with that, I'll kick it to Dan to take a look at the federal.
Thanks. So typically when we talk about the defense industry, we're referring to arms producers, weapons makers, makers of aircraft, ships, all the electrical systems, software peripherals, and also R&D and training that go along with those things. And for the most part, they get most of the biggest Pentagon contracts. However, there are companies outside of that scope of activity, like Pfizer or Humana, or the Caterpillar corporation that makes like huge construction vehicles and equipment, that are also getting billion-dollar contracts from the Department of Defense as well. Which meaning that if you're interested in, say, who is advocating to keep the Pentagon budget big, you may want to look further than just weapons producers. Like the 2024 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA as it's commonly known, is the legislation most lobbied so far in 2023. And a lot of those companies lobbying on it are outside of the defense industry, but are still targeting it. So today, mostly what I'm going to talk about are those weapons and direct military services and products companies here today. But there's so much money involved, and it's such a broad issue that companies and organizations from other industries are also involved in trying to influence defense policy. So at the federal level, one of the biggest avenues of influence in terms of money is lobbying of the federal government, which amounts to $4 billion in spending each year overall. We only get disclosure as part of that money that for direct attempts to influence government officials by contacting them. So things like grassroots lobbying or PR campaigns and advertising are not included in that figure. Particular to this defense issue, if you've ever been to DC or been through the subway station at the Pentagon, you know that it's literally covered top to bottom in advertisements for weapons systems and defense companies. So they, something you're going to hear me say several times, they know who their target audience is. But even limiting to that strict definition of lobbying that doesn't include all the spending on advertising and the like, the defense industry spent about $140 million in 2022 at the federal level, and $72 million so far in just the first 6 months of 2023. And they have a team of over 800 registered lobbyists at their disposal. And while the defense industry spends less than a number of other industries, they do have a concentration of power in just a handful of companies, really. Though there are about 300 defense companies and industry groups that have reported lobbying so far just this year, the top 6 spenders on lobbying account for almost half of that 2023 spending. So to name them, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, General Atomics, and Raytheon make up about 40% of that lobbying spending. And it goes up to about 47% if you include Boeing, which is a little tricky because they're a huge defense contractor, but they also have a major civilian business as well. Of course, every industry has aspects that kind of make them unique in the way they operate, but defense goes a little bit beyond in this respect. That core of companies that I just named has essentially one customer or overseer. And in addition to the $250 billion worth of weapons purchases that the Department of Defense makes, the overseas sales that those companies make, which also amount to hundreds of billions of dollars in any given year, are often subject to State Department and congressional approval. So again, that's their target. Um, our research shows that just in the last 6 months, General Dynamics, Northrop Grumman, General Atomics, Lockheed Martin, and Raytheon, so essentially all those big companies, all reported lobbying the State Department or Pentagon officials, specifically on foreign military sales. Now, in addition to all that lobbying spending, another major avenue supporting their influence is campaign contributions going to candidates and parties primarily. Those major 6 companies that dominate the industry spent at least $8 million on the midterm elections in 2022. The industry as a whole gave 43 million, and more than half of that was directed to candidates by the company's PACs. So those are political action committees that can make contributions using the company's name, though they have to raise the money from their employers. They can't use the actual business revenue to do it, but they're able to give in the company's name. And note that the PAC is very often run and controlled by the company's lobbyists. And our research has found that they also clearly target members of the congressional committees that oversee and fund them. Of the $20 million the defense industry gave to members of Congress during the 117th Congress, more than a quarter of it went to members of just one committee, and that's House Armed Services, which of course originates their budget among other oversight activities. Another way that the industry accesses power in Washington is via the revolving door, meaning the passage of people from government jobs to the private sector and vice versa. We looked at Pentagon employees who went on to be registered defense lobbyists and found over 100 in the last few decades and over 500 with employment in those congressional committees that provide oversight, including like the Armed Services Committees, of course, and Foreign Relations, and the Defense Appropriations Subcommittees. And that's a significant number. These are well-connected people helping their companies navigate the policy machinery that they are very familiar with because they have worked there in the past. And just looking at the industry's registered lobbyists, 3/4 of them fall in this category of having experience and connections in the government they're paid to influence. In addition, the lobbyists are giving to campaigns as individuals as well. 4 of the top 10 lobbyists who are the biggest givers of campaign contributions personally, 4 of the top 10 have at least one defense client they work for. So these folks are giving themselves, they're directing the PAC money, and then seeking meetings with the same politicians that they've given to, and in some cases worked for, to push their issues. So what is all this money going towards? Well, based on lobbying reports, they most often focus on the major government funding vehicles, the NDAA being the main one, of course, but they also advocate for funding for other agencies, especially around R&D funding. So agencies like FAA, they lobby on their budget. They're also interested in things like biologics research and a number of programs at other agencies. So it's clear that weapons manufacturers and their customers are an important part of the influence machinery in Washington, D.C. Uh, that continues to sell billions of dollars worth of deadly weapons, both to the Department of Defense and abroad. And researchers have shown that those weapons sold abroad often end up being used not necessarily as defensive deterrence as they as the argument is made before the sales happen to justify them. They often say they're for to keep conflict from breaking out, but they also, research shows that those weapons often end up fueling destruction in conflict zones around the world. And I also should say that money in politics is not the only thing to consider here. This is obviously a kind of a sensitive area. Many factors shape those policies of arms sales going overseas, including national security issues, diplomacy, economic development concessions. But what's clear is that weapons manufacturers have a seat at the table when policy decisions that they deem to be important are being made. So that's kind of an overview of the spending and some of the ways that the defense industry tries to influence policy and spending decisions. But I also want to walk you through some of the resources that we have at OpenSecrets and then Pete will talk about the state stuff at Follow the Money. On the topic of defense, the best place to start, and I will share my screen at this point, is our capitalizing on conflict page. And here you can find all the latest in news articles we're writing, but also some reports that we've written that are a little bigger in scope. And this page aims to pull together a lot of our work on defense, including those articles and reports and some data resources. This see the defense industry's political spending data link down here will take you to a Google Sheet where you can see a lot of the specific data pulled together. Now, this spreadsheet includes both state and federal data on lobbying and campaign contributions, as well as a list of recent defense lobbyists who have been through the revolving door, with links to more detail about their lobbying activities and their employment history where they've worked. In addition to including in here the state information, one advantage of this sheet is that unlike a standard industry profile on OpenSecrets, which I'll show you next, it includes contributions to leadership PACs, which are PACs controlled by members of Congress, where they can dole out money, often to kind of increase their clout. But it also rolls Boeing into everything. And Boeing is, as I mentioned, tricky because our methodology of industry categorization is based largely on the revenue they're getting from this different types of business, and Boeing, especially recently, is about 50-50 between commercial and defense. So just keep in mind that sometimes if you're looking at defense, you want to ask yourself the question, is this including Boeing? And in the spreadsheet, it always does. So I'm not going to go through every tab in here, but like I said, there's federal and state information on the overall spending in lobbying and contributions, the organizations that are spending money lobbying, who's getting the campaign contributions, and which companies are giving the most campaign contributions, as well as some of that revolving door information about their lobbyists. Now, for a more standard look at our defense industry profile, and we have these for several hundred industries. But this one is also a great place to start. It includes a lot of data on contributions in lobbying, both historical as well as narrowing down to an election cycle or year to look at exactly who in Congress is getting money, who's giving it to them. And in all these pages, you can select cycles going back over 30 years. In a lot of cases, the lobbying data goes back to about 1998, which is the first year there was digital data disclosed. Now, to focus in on lobbying, back up just a bit. Here in the lobbying section, this profiles federal lobbying activity and spending, where you can again look at historical totals, see who's spending the most, what industries, how much any given industry is spending, what are the bills that attract the most attention, all of that stuff here. But just to look at defense a little more closely, and then to narrow it down to aerospace here, you can see how much is spent over the years, going back a few decades, what lobbying firms and individual lobbyists were hired by defense companies and their associated lobbying firms. And for the lobbyists here who have a revolving door history, that's what these little circular arrows do. They will take you to a revolving door profile that talks about where this person has worked over the years. But to look at a specific company, so Lockheed Martin is one of the biggest spenders on defense issues. There's a lot more information here. Again, they're spending over the years, who they're hiring, what lobbyists work for them. But the really interesting stuff is in these issues, agencies, and bills tabs. The report images page will link you back to the actual Senate Office of Public Records images of the actual report as it's filed. But pretty much everything in those reports is getting translated onto these various pages. So for instance, you can look at what industries Lockheed Martin reported contacting in the first 6 months of the year, which is, these are filed quarterly. So we currently have January through June, and it will be late October when we get information about what has happened in July, August, and September. You can also look at what issues they reported working on. Now, this is based on, there's a list of about 90 predetermined general issue areas, such as defense, transportation, taxes. So they're pretty broad areas. But these are how the reports are organized into sections where they say what they did on each of these issue areas. And for any of them here, you can click on the number under specific issues and see what was actually written on the reports that were filed for them. So instead of having to go to each lobbying firm they hired and comb through the report, you can see all of those different reports, what they wrote for what they're doing on defense issues. And this is also where we find information about the bills they worked on, for instance, and you're able to filter this text. So if you're specifically interested in the F-35 uh, Joint Strike Fighter program, you can narrow down only the reports where they mention that and see what kind of context they give about what they're working on. Now, while I'm in this issues section, I should say that this is also a good way to kind of get at that non-weapons part of defense influence. So if you go to the issue profile, this kind of aggregates everybody from any industry who reported lobbying on defense issues. And you can see that the companies I've been talking about are definitely on here, but so are manufacturing companies like GE. You'll find tech companies on here. So these are all companies who reported lobbying on some kind of defense issues. So this is another way to get at those other industries that might be involved in an issue debate. So that's a pretty good tour of the federal data. I will say I've mentioned the foreign military sales several times here. If you're interested in that, you might also want to check out our Foreign Lobby Watch program that collects the Foreign Agents Registration Act filings. And for the last 8 or 9 years, we've been entering the spending from these reports, so you can get an idea of the scope of how much is being spent and by whom and what countries they're from. But we also have the ability to search the full text of those reports going all the way back to the 40s, I believe. And this is relevant because some of these countries that have to file these reports, or political parties or companies that are from overseas, mention advocating or trying to obtain weapons sales from US companies. So that can sometimes be a good place to look, just another angle of things. And you can also look for information about those sales. There's a group called CIPRI that puts out a report every year and a bunch of data about who is selling arms all around the world and who's buying them. And for a more US focus, you could also check out the Security Assistance Monitor and the Forum on the Arms Trade. And they both have collected data on public notifications of those sales and for some years actual delivery amounts. And the Forum on the Arms Trade in particular has a lot of information about legislation related to arms sales, if that's relevant to your reporting. And with that, I think I'll hand things back to Pete to talk a little bit about what's happening at the state level.
Great, thanks, Dan. So we have a website at followthemoney.org that houses our state data at the moment. As a result of the ongoing work we are doing to consolidate our databases between the Center for Responsive Politics and the National Institute on Money and Politics. So I'm going to be focusing here on the followthemoney.org website to have a look at the state lobbying data. This website is very much designed to allow you to run queries for data sets that you might like. The easiest way to get into the query interface is to go up here to this Ask Anything button.
I'm
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you, but I don't think anyone is able to see your screen.
Oh,
So you
one
might
moment.
want to double check that.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So on the followmoney.org website, what I was referring to for running that query is this Ask Anything button up here in the upper right. And then changing the contributions data to lobbying expenditure data. And then these are those options that I was referring to. You can look at spender by name or by industry. You look for specific recipients, so the firms or the lobbyists that are getting paid, or look at the spending within a state or a year. I clicked on the spender to get to the industry of the spenders. So we can look at spending by the defense industry. And these are those classifications I was referring to in the 3-tier classification system here. But just clicking on defense will capture everything in there. And we have show me lobbying spending by the defense industry. Then we just click on go. And that will land us on a page that looks kind of like this. Originally, we'll just have some empty checkboxes here, but we can click on different boxes to group this data up kind of like an Excel pivot table. So on this display, I have clicked on the year option. And so this is totaling the dollars spent by the defense industry per year. And then by clicking the little plus boxes, we can create additional displays. And I've made a few of them here. This one totals by state. So those big states that we were talking about, always being at the top of the list, are present here for the defense industry as well. And then we can click on year and state to display the totals by state and year for the industry. Then we can get into more detail about who these actors are. So Lockheed Martin is the largest defense industry lobbying spender at the state level, just as it currently is at the federal level. But you see a lot of recognizable names here as well. Then we can see how much each one of these companies is spending in each state over time by clicking on the spender and the state and getting a sense of where each one of these companies is focusing their efforts. And then here I've added the state, the year, and the spender. And so we can see L3Harris Technologies spending almost $1 million in Florida in 2012, and similarly 900,000 in 2013, really kind of dominating the list there in Florida, where Lockheed Martin has been focusing more in California. Unfortunately, at the state level, we are not typically able to collect information about the bills that they're lobbying on. So the federal lobbying disclosures do include some information about the bills or the preset issues that Dan mentioned. That is occasionally available in the states, but typically not, and typically not in a particularly usable format. California, for example, does have a place in their electronic filings for these organizations to indicate what they're lobbying on. But they're big memo fields, and they will have a lot of stuff kind of crammed into them, paragraphs of stuff that are difficult for us to standardize into a usable format so you can get a list of bills and that sort of thing. But if you are interested in what is being lobbied on, always reach out to us and we can let you know if we have something that might be of help. But here on this website, because of those standardization issues and the fact that it's just so rarely reported to begin with, we're just looking at how much the spenders are spending and how much, who they're paying. We are looking across time here. So as we saw, a lot of years are available in this query. I'm going to limit this to just the last couple of years here, and we'll take a look at a little bit more detail. So I've clicked on this little pad and pencil icon next to my query of state level lobbying spending by the defense spenders. That allows me to just alter this query. I'm just going to go with 2022 and so far in 2023. And so now this is pulling up the spending in just the last couple of years. grouped it up by year here, and some of these other groupings that we saw earlier. Just having a look at whether or not these patterns hold up in recent years. Seems to be the case. We are seeing some of those states, big states in the top list. Connecticut is kind of popping up here recently in 2022 as well. But those spenders look very similar. The big groups that Dan was talking about are present here. And then we can do all these breakdowns just within those 2 years. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is the ability to really create a data set that might that can answer the specific questions that you have about how much each company is spending on lobbying in each year or in each state, and generating the tables that you need for your analysis as you are reporting going forward. I'll also mention that everything that we do here is reflected in this URL, which is why sometimes it gets a little long. But we're looking at lobbying spending by the defense industry in these years. And then these different grouping options are the different grouping options that I've selected on each of these little displays. What this means is that you can take links to any of the tables that you generate and embed them in an online news article. And it will take your reader directly to the tables that you have been looking at as well. I will also note that from this website, you can actually download the tables that you generate. You would need to register or log into an account on the followthemoney.org website. It's free. It just makes sure that you're a human and you can download up to 1,000 rows of information from the tables that you generate for free. And then beyond that, they will ask you to reach out to us to have conversations about what exactly you need, and we can help you get larger data sets if you'd like. Lobbying at the state level is really quite variable, the disclosure aspects, as I talked about. We do have a, to go to OpenSecrets.org, we published a scorecard recently about transparency in lobbying. I'm not going to dwell too much on this because we covered this on the first webinar that we did here. But under news and reports, and then reports here, you can find lots of different reports related to lobbying and other topics, but there is also a state lobbying disclosure scorecard report here as well. I encourage folks to check it out, see how their states are doing, how different states compare to each other, and so forth. As I mentioned, the biggest hurdle for us is really that the compensation piece, that overwhelming portion of money spent on lobbying that is paid by companies and firms, or companies and other clients to firms and lobbyists to represent them, is not disclosed in about half of the states. And that gets highlighted pretty well here in the scorecard, in addition to other aspects such as how frequently disclosure reports are filed and other details as well. That all varies by state. And Dan mentioned contributions from the industry too. And I will have a look quickly at the contributions from the defense industry at the state level as well. If I go into followthemoney.org and the Ask Anything button again, this has us looking at contributions data, and I'm going to look specifically at contributions to people who are currently sitting in state legislative office at the state level from the defense industry. So I'm going to go contributions from the industry. There are many, many options here for our contributions data. I'm just going to do contributions from industry and then defense. It's the same classification system on both websites for both lobbying and contributions, so you can use that same classification. And I'm going to do contributions to sitting legislators at the state level. So contributions to, and you see we have candidates, ballot measure committees, party committees. I'm going to go with office holders here, and those sitting in the House and Senate, so a type of office. So I'm looking at contributions from the defense industry to sitting legislative office holders in 2023. This is the results page. So there are about $1.7 million in contributions from the industry to people who are currently sitting in office in 2023. I've grouped this up by the office holder for this first table display. So you can see who's received the most money, and it's Richard Saslaw, a member of the Virginia State Senate. We can also take a look at the partisan breakdown. This leans a little bit Republican, but it is not overwhelmingly so. This tends to be true for for-profit industries for the most part. They will tend to be pretty even between Republican and Democratic recipients. Mostly they give to people who are incumbents. Then we get a breakdown of where those contributions are coming per state. We have Virginia and Texas at the top of the list here from the industry. Those are states where there are no campaign contribution limits. So you can write as large of a check to those to candidates in those states as you'd like. California has high contribution limits, although they do have limits. And you can kind of get a breakdown on this page here of what contribution limits look like. And I'll drop a link to this into the chat momentarily as well. But just pointing out that states regulate things differently. So Texas, for example, has no contribution limits. And just to break down by state and by year to demonstrate the two different selection options being used to create that sort of combined pivot table. And then here are the largest contributors from the industry. So again, very similar names here. We're seeing Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and the other names that we saw for the lobbying data. Campaign contributions really are used by corporations and other organizations to pave the way for lobbying. So what you're looking at with campaign contributions is that these dollars are given to incumbents who are running for office, A, because they're already in office making decisions, and B, because they're going to win their reelection. That happens about 95% of the time or so. And so it's a pretty safe bet for them to make those contributions to those office holders. They tend not to care too much about party affiliation, although we did see that at the state level, at least, the contributions here lean a little bit Republican. But really that incumbency aspect is what organizations like this tend to care about. They need to be paving the way for their lobbyists to get in the door. And so that's how the contributions piece kind of ties on. There are lots of different options on this website for things to select, display by and query by. Just wanted to demonstrate very quickly what some of those options are. We can create pretty much any data set that you might need. So please feel free to reach out to us and we can help you run queries on the site or provide data sets to you as well. And with that, Dan, I'll pass it back to you for closing and prepping for Q&A.
Sure, thanks. If you have any questions for us now, we have some time for that if you want to put them in the Q&A feature of the Zoom window. And I'll just echo what Pete said about feeling free to contact us with any questions you may have or custom data you may want, or if you think of something you think is out there but you don't see on the website, just go ahead and ask us and we'll hopefully be able to help you. I'll also mention again that the next one of these webinars is in about a month on September 13th, where we'll talk about energy interests and the environment. With that, I guess I'll ask Anna if she has any Q&A for us.
We do indeed.
Excellent.
So just to kick us off, this is one question probably for you, Dan, but Pete, if you want to weigh in as well, that would be great. How does OpenSecrets count lobbying or political spending by joint ventures such as Bell Boeing or United Launch Alliance?
Well, often they get counted as their own thing. For instance, I know United Launch Alliance will have their own lobbying profile. And that will also happen in any case where it's like a 50-50 joint venture. Now, for an example where where Boeing is 60% of it, we very well may decide to associate that with Boeing's spending over the other party. But generally, if they're pretty even, you're going to find those things under their own name. So you, if you're interested in Boeing, for instance, you may want to search for just Boeing. And then the search results should give you a list of anything where their name appears, which is usually the case with a lot of these joint ventures. But like I said, I know United Launch Alliance has its own lobbying profile.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that. It is difficult for us to sort of like allocate dollars to companies, right? And on joint venture kind of pieces, it is important to demonstrate that that is a joint venture that is engaged in that effort, where it is not overwhelmingly one party that's really running it. And so the same thing will be true for the state level.
Great. A related follow-up question. What does OpenSecrets do with spending data for companies that are later acquired or merged?
I can take that one, at least at the federal level. So mergers are a little more complicated. If there's an acquisition, we just, from that point in time, or in terms of like the election cycle when the acquisition happened, or the year in reference to lobbying, it becomes part of the now parent organization. When there's a merger of equals, we try to keep them separate in the past in most cases, or at least maintain the ability to do that. You'll see we have organization profiles on the site that pull together all kinds of contribution and lobbying information, and are meant to be a landing point if you're interested in a company. Those, I believe, we combine everything back in the past, but like in lobbying, if you go look at Raytheon Technologies, which is the current version of Raytheon, it starts in 2020. However, right under, on their main lobbying page are links to Raytheon Company, which is their previous name, and United Technologies, in which those two companies merged to make Raytheon Technologies. So in most cases, it's pretty easy to figure out the history and add things in or take them out as fits your purposes. But we do try to keep up with mergers and acquisitions so that the way we're representing a company and their money on OpenSecrets reflects reality. Pete, is there anything additional at state level?
Same thing for the state level. So we track those as well at the mergers and acquisitions, presenting the names of the organizations that are engaging in lobbying or other political activities as they existed at the time. So it can mean that sometimes tying those dollars to an existing organization that might be new might mean pulling in contributions or lobbying efforts by a couple of different organizations. But similarly, we can set up relationships between those companies so that you have that parent-child relationship, or the merge relationship where a company becomes a different one, so that those dollars are relatively easy to identify. But really what we're trying to do here is reflect what happened at the time.
Great, thank you. And here's one more for you, Dan. Is the most recent Q2 2023 data available for download right now?
Yes, we've finished processing the Q2 filings. They are on the website. If you're a bulk data user, which is mostly, we're talking about academics in that case, the second quarter is not included in the bulk data downloads, but it is available throughout the website on the standard company profiles, industry profiles. All of that will include the most recent lobbying filings.
Great, and that's always something that we can send as well if there's something custom that people are looking for as well.
Exactly, yeah.
Great. One more question to finish us off. I know that this might have already been answered a bit over the course of our discussion, but So actually one more with that, when will the bulk data be available to download if we have an answer to that?
I'd have to double check. We usually only update the bulk data once or twice a year, and I believe the plan was to do so in June, which means that the Q2 would not be in there for several months yet.
I will add that at the state level, as I alluded to earlier on, the filing periods vary quite a bit. In some states, they will be quarterly filings, whereas in others they might be monthly or bi-monthly, and in some maybe twice a year. So we're collecting the data as quickly as we can at the state level as well. It is then incorporated into those displays that we were looking at on the followthemoney.org website. And that is a little bit variable in terms of timeliness from the states because of those different filing periods as well. We're always able to talk about how up to date something is or when the last time the state had a report, if folks are interested.
And I'll jump back in to reiterate that, especially for academics and journalists, we want to get you what you need to do your reporting. So anything that you need, feel free to reach out and we'll see what we can do.
And with that, I think I'll pass it back to both of you for the closing.
Yeah, just thank you for attending again. September 13th, we're going to talk about energy interests and the environment. And thank you for all of your questions.
Thanks so much, everyone. And we really do a lot of work to put this together for you guys. So please do reach out if there's anything we might be able to help with. That's why we're here. Take care.